some confusion, and so I just want to make sure that everybody's clear on what we were looking for in that assignment. And also it kind of leads into our invasive species talk for today. I also wanted to go over another a little bit of confusion that was happening during graded practice number 4. And then we're going to dive into our plan for today, which is invasive species. We're going to watch a video, and then we're going to start the homework that is graded practice number 9. That's not going to be due until Monday, November 30th. So you have some time to work on it. And then just a reminder that Monday, November 30th is actually just a catch-up day. I'm not assigning anything new on that asynchronous Monday. But what me and Mr. Austin were noticing is that there is a lot of missing assignments out there. So that Monday, that catch-up day, and maybe even over your 5-day weekend would be a really great time for you to catch up on your ecology homework that's missing. And then a reminder too that you have a test coming up on ecology. So all of those homework assignments help you prepare for that test on December 3rd. And so if you haven't done them, or if you're missing a bunch, that is going to end up hurting you in your preparation for that test. There's also a review sheet and 2 practice tests that are available in the ecology module. So if you wanted to, you could start studying for that test that's coming up on Thursday, December 3rd. So today we're learning about invasive species, and then the Tuesday after this break, we're going to also be looking at invasive species. Then you have a review day on Wednesday, and the test is on Thursday. What questions do you have about this plan, or what's coming up, or the test? All right. So here is the review that I wanted to make sure that people understood. So this was from graded practice number 4, and Mr. Austin and I have graded all of the assignments that have been turned in before. For me, it would be before today. So if you turned it in this morning, I haven't looked at it yet. But I wanted to clear up some confusion on this. So what I was looking for when I asked for what trophic level is the shrew, I was actually looking for the term we use to describe his trophic level. So where he is in this food chain. So going back to our levels of trophic levels, we have the grass is our producer, right? Grass is a plant that produces its own energy. So the grasshopper then is a primary consumer when it eats the grass. And I'm going to use a 1 with a degree sign to represent primary consumer, because that's another way to annotate that. And then the shrew, when it eats the grasshopper, is a secondary consumer. And then the owl, when it eats that shrew, is a tertiary consumer. So what I was looking for my students is I wanted you to say that the shrew was a secondary consumer and that the owl was a tertiary consumer. But what happened was people were giving me a number, just a single number. And I think that came from some confusion in your notes where I numbered these trophic levels at the bottom. And I said 1, the grass, the producer is the first trophic level, the grasshopper is the second, the shrew would be considered the 3rd trophic level, and the owl is the 4th. And so I had a lot of students writing 3 and 4 in these 2. And what I was actually looking for was the secondary consumer and the tertiary consumer. So if you got those wrong for my students, that's why I was looking for the term that we use for that level. So that's what I was looking for. And then the other thing I saw a lot of is a lot of people were calling the producer the sun. Okay, I had a lot of students saying the producer was the sun. So the sun is not living. It's an abiotic factor. So it doesn't get a term. We don't give it a name in the trophic levels. So producers are our plants. They're the organism that produces its own energy. So while the sun, some people might want to argue, well, the sun produces energy. It does. You're right. But when we're talking about trophic levels, the producers are always our plants. So this should have been grass. But like I said, I saw a lot of sun here. And then, sorry, I'm trying to write with my mouse here, grass. Mr. Austin and I also both saw people like labeling the sun as the first trophic level, and that's also not accurate. Mr. Austin, did you want to add anything to that?
No, you're doing great.
Okay. All right. So moving on to the more recent stuff from yesterday. So you were given different food chains and different scenarios, and you were supposed to use a red arrow and a red down arrow and a green up arrow and a red X to determine what happened to these food chains. And I just wanted to clarify, because I saw quite a few people making the same mistake. So when you read the scenario here, humans are overfishing an area in the Arctic and are harvesting over half of the silverfish in the area. So our silverfish are going down. So silverfish population is going down. So then you are supposed to go through this food chain and say how would it affect all the other organisms in that food chain? So if there are less silverfish eating the krill, what's going to happen to the krill population?
It would go up.
Yeah, it would go up. So if there's less things eating an organism, its population is not going to, it's going to increase, right? And if the krill population increases, what will happen to the plankton that it eats?
It'll decrease.
Yeah. So it's, even though the silverfish doesn't eat the plankton, its decrease ends up affecting the plankton, right? So this is this actually plays into today's lesson on invasive species too, because invasive species can take a food chain and flip it around and make these changes happen because they take up food or space and cause the food chain to change. Okay, so then we got our leopard seal up here. If there's less silverfish, what's going to happen to our leopard seal in the area?
Go down.
Yep, so the leopard seal will go down. If there's less leopard seal, what happens to the orcas in the area?
Increase. It also goes down.
Yep. So if a population goes down in the middle of a food chain, the organisms above it that rely on it are going to go down. But that doesn't mean everything below it goes up, because if there's more krill, there's going to be less plankton. All right. Oops, let me get my annotating here. Okay, so let me go through one more of these. So this one was addressing the polar bear. So if there's less ice for the polar bear to live, so he's losing habitat, then the bear population is going to go down, because if they don't have ice to hunt from and to live on, then their population in that area is going to go down. So if the population of the bears go down, what will happen to the ring seal population if there's less bears in an area? So there's less bears eating the ringed seal.
The ring seal would go up.
Yeah, the ring seal population is going to go up because there's not as many bears eating it. Right? So if you take out a couple bears, then that seal population is not going to be getting eaten by the bear. So if the ring seal population goes up, what happens to the Arctic cod that it eats?
They would go down.
Yep. So we would have a decrease in the Arctic cod because there's more ring seals eating them. If we have a decrease in the Arctic cod, what's going to happen to the shrimp that the cod eats?
It would go up.
Yep. And if there's more shrimp eating that algae, the algae population will do what?
Go down.
Yep. So in this one, the polar bears decrease caused an up, down scenario in this food chain. And that's what I was looking for you to understand in these questions from yesterday. So you might want to just check your answers before you submit, or if you look at that assignment and notice that you didn't do that accurately, you can go in and fix it and resubmit. I think Mr. Austin has already graded his students' assignment of this, the ones that were turned in before today. I have not gotten to it yet, but the ones that I did see, I saw their mistakes that were being made. So just wanted to clarify that. All right. I'm not going to do this one because I think we got to the gist of that assignment from yesterday. Okay, so today our goal is to understand what an invasive species is. So we have some vocab that we're going to go over: invasive species, native species, adapt, and the word biodiversity. So our essential question today is, what are invasive species? How do they show up in an area, and what do they do to a native ecosystem? And hopefully after today and also next Tuesday, you should be able to say this I can statement. I can identify invasive species and predict how they will impact the biodiversity in the native populations. All right, so we are going to watch a video, but before we do that, I just want to tell you, give you a couple examples of some invasive species that have driven me personally completely crazy in the last few years. So I own a piece of forest land out towards Viroqua, Wisconsin, and we have an invasive species growing there called buckthorn. And buckthorn is a type of plant that was actually brought here because people thought it would make a nice ornamental bush, but it ended up taking over all these forests in Minnesota and Wisconsin. And one of the ways it does that is it stays green longer in the fall. So when every other tree in the forest loses its leaves, buckthorn stays green. So it has a longer lifespan than the other trees in the area. It also is the first tree in the forest to get green leaves in the spring. Okay, so that's part of its adaptation of how it actually is taking over the forest. And then also people want to cut it down. So they just cut it down. And this is what it does when you just cut it down. It comes back 10 times bigger. It forms a crown. And so the stump that you cut down, you thought, I'm getting rid of this buckthorn, it now has 10 babies growing out of it. And those babies make more berries, and this tree has the ability to completely take over a forest. And so I'm actually trying to kill the buckthorn in my forest right now. and it's taking us to cut down these trees and then poison the stump so that this crown doesn't form. Another one that I can't stand that drives me nuts is garlic mustard. So garlic mustard is a plant that's taking over woods and forests all around our area. And it does this by producing hundreds and hundreds of seeds from one plant. So it shoots out all of its seeds in the fall, and then in spring, it's the first small plant that comes up in the woods. And so no other plants have any sunlight. So this is what it looks like after garlic mustard has taken over a forest. And it doesn't take long for it to be the only plant that's growing in a forest in the spring. So these are two examples of local invasive species that have personally driven me crazy because I'm trying to get rid of them in my forest, little plot of forest that I own. All right, so we're gonna watch a video. I'm gonna stop sharing this. And oops, I need to get rid of here. We're gonna watch a little video here on what an invasive species is and how do they get to us? Like, how do they get to an area that they're not native to? So if you would right now, can you turn off your video if you're showing your video? I think that's Mr. Austin and one other person here, and I'm going to turn mine off too so that we can watch this video without it glitching. So here we go with a little introduced or invasive species and biodiversity.
At first glance, it might seem that introducing new species, the human act of taking species from somewhere else and dropping them in a different area, would be good for biodiversity. Let's face it, if you take a bunch of beautiful flowers and plant them in your garden, you're increasing the biodiversity in your garden, right? You raise the species richness in your garden. But it's not a simple additive equation. It's more complicated than that. The term introduced species is synonymous with exotic species. The definition is any species that, through the activities of humans, is knowingly or accidentally transferred from its native habitat into one in which it doesn't naturally occur. An introduced species is the opposite of a native species, which is one that occurs in an area naturally, without human intervention. Many introductions are intentional. We do it on purpose, and we've been doing that for a heck of a long time, probably ever since humans came onto the scene and realized that they could pick something up that was alive and bring it somewhere else to serve their purposes, from goats and pigs to cattle and crops. Mostly we transport organisms that will do some good for us through agricultural means. We've been introducing plants and animals to places where they weren't native for a long, long time. Usually when people think about introduced species, they're really thinking more about the accidental ones, the things that happen coincidentally alongside human activities. When we introduce a species to a new area, everything that's living on, in, or with that species comes along with it. If you pick up a cow from one place and move it to another, it's going to bring along all the parasites that those cows normally deal with. I think people immediately picture images of rats streaming off the ships when they pull into some beautiful Tahitian paradise, or the snakes that came into Guam with military movements during World War II. These animals are legendary in doing damage to native birds. They're very obvious ways that introduced organisms radically change biodiversity in a single place. There are so many other subtle ways that introductions happen and cause problems. The bottom line is that the world economy is hit with an annual cost of $1.4 trillion dealing with the negative impacts, obvious and not so obvious, of introduced species. That's a number I have a hard time wrapping my mind around. If you had an extra $1.4 trillion to play around with, there's a lot of possibility to do some good in the world. Because humans have been introducing new species for a long time, the concept of native habitat is a little bit slippery. The human activities that cause the transfer can happen long before we recognize that it actually happened. So that sometimes the history of an introduction can be lost. When we aren't sure of the history, up until the point we are sure or have some reasonable evidence, we call those species cryptogenic. Crypto means hidden. Genic means origin. Solving the riddles of cryptogenic species underscores another reason why collections are so important. The only way to trace the origins of introductions is to know what was there beforehand. Collections can preserve that historical information, and collections made today establish baselines for future reference. If those collections are maintained in perpetuity, those baselines are going to be good 100 years from now or 1,000 years from now when we see a radically different and altered environment due to the introductions. So we can use collections to try and get answers to this problem. Not all species are, in fact, harmful. Clearly, they're not all harmful to us because the ones that we introduce on purpose are ones that are there for our benefit. Some introduced species can provide new food sources or even habitats for native species. Native species aren't always helpless and harmed. They can make use of some of the newcomers. Introduced grasses and corn, for example, are eaten by native species, and certain trees that have been introduced can serve as habitats for birds. Some introduced species live under our radar. We don't even know they're there, doing little perceivable damage to the ecosystem by reducing species richness. But some introduced species certainly go beyond just living peacefully alongside the natives. They can do this because they have competitive advantages. They lack natural controls, such as the predators or diseases that keep them in check in their native habitats. Some invasive species are generalists, which means they can tolerate, reproduce rapidly, and thrive in a wide range of environmental conditions, allowing them to successfully compete with and overwhelm native populations. When introduced species take over an environment at the expense of native species, they're known as invasive species. All invasive species are introduced, but not all introduced species are invasive. Here's an example of consequences for humans as well as for species richness. In 1992, an introduced species of comb jelly was found in the Black Sea. Comb jellies are weird, transparent, jellyfish-like forms with a voracious appetite for fish larvae and eggs. Within months, that single introduction resulted in the total collapse of the anchovy fishery in the Black Sea. Comb jellies tolerated the conditions in the Black Sea, and their population exploded at the expense of the anchovies. The bottom line here is that introduced species can outcompete the natives for food, for space, and other resources. They alter the ecosystem's food webs, disturbing crucial elements and interactions that would otherwise contribute to healthy ecosystem function. The comb jelly is a good example of that. Sure, your species list for the Black Sea has gone up by 1, but it destroyed all the anchovies. You have to take a species off the list. Plus, perhaps whatever else was eating the anchovies. And before you know it, because there's nothing for the comb jellies to eat anymore, they're gone too. So, not only have you not added a species, but in the end, you've actually subtracted a whole bunch. So invasive species are ultimately organisms that cause decreases in ecosystem function. That's another definition of invasives that we need to come to grips with. What's worse, invasives very seldom come by themselves. As I was saying with the cow example, they often come with new diseases, new parasites, new accompanying effects that we can hardly predict. Another good example of invasives are pathogens, something that we don't often consider as invasives. These include disease-causing organisms like fungi or bacteria and even viruses. These are things that we also introduce to wild populations, and there are extinctions that come from that. In fact, in the past 500 years, we've directly caused the extinction of more than 100 species of birds, partly through the introduction of disease, and heck knows what damage we did to organisms that were depending on those birds. In the forest realm, Dutch elm disease was something that, when I was growing up, was a huge thing, and actually it still is. In North America, Dutch elm disease left skeletal trees for miles and miles. When I was a kid growing up in Toronto in the 60s, 80% of the elms in the city were killed, and it was really sad. Those trees were not only gorgeous, they were very important lumber. Elm trees were a direct service to us in so many different ways, from producing shade to furniture. The fungus was introduced by bark beetles, some of which were native and some of which were introduced, both of which supported and co-evolved with the fungal pathogen, which could not be stopped. This idea of being a generalist, the ability to reproduce and displace natives, the ability to become more abundant at the expense of other species, to introduce diseases, to proliferate in non-native habitats, that should sound pretty familiar, because that's us. In some ways, we are the ultimate invasive species. We don't just introduce ourselves, we are invasive. The difference is that, unlike the comb jellies and the bark beetles and cows, we're capable of recognizing that fact and maybe mitigating our impact. We can look at the world and the problems and start thinking about ways to control invasives, to corral them, maybe to reduce their effects, and not introduce them in the first place. We have to, not just for moral reasons, I think, but because, ironically, and as we said earlier, the invasives that we're bringing with us, accidentally or on purpose, can do a lot of harm to species upon which we depend. Worse, they can upset healthy ecological functions upon which all life depends, including us.
All right. So that was a pretty detailed video showing introduced species and then how they turn invasive if they end up harming an ecosystem. So what I want you to do now is let's take a look at ecology graded practice number 9, the one that's due for Monday. And I'm going to turn my video back on here. So this assignment is a reading and a little bit, you're going to be doing a little bit of research on an invasive species that you're interested in. So it starts off as a general reading about invasive species. So you can go through and read this, and I would like you to read it. And then you're going to answer questions about the different animals that they have given examples for. So there's I think there's 4 different animals that were introduced to areas by humans. So that's the other thing that's important to understand about invasive species is it's humans who usually bring these in, either intentionally because they think that they can do some good, or unintentionally, like accidentally they get brought in. So the brown tree snake, the hydrilla, the cane toad, and the kudzu. Oh, and then the lionfish from the video is also another one that is talked about here. And the emerald ash borer, which is a insect that is actually killing ash trees all over our area even. So some examples that you're going to end up answering questions about. So I want to go through and help you with these definitions here. So these are all words that are bolded in the passage, and you could read and write your own definition if you wanted to, but I just wanted to go over what these words mean and take some of that work off of your plate. So the word adapt. So you've probably heard the word adapt, and in the ecology sense, it's to become adjusted to the new conditions. So something has changed. For something to have to adapt, there has to be a change. So to adapt is to become adjusted to your new conditions in order to survive. So adapting is becoming adjusted. And that might mean finding a new food source. That might mean growing in a different direction if you're a tree or a plant. Sometimes you see trees that have really weird shapes in the woods because they had to change direction of where they were growing in order to reach the sun. And that would be an example of a plant that adapted. So the next two terms, native species and invasive species. So a native is, I like to consider it like the locals, the ones that lived in the area naturally. So these are the species that lived there naturally. They didn't get brought in, they evolved there. And they've been there for a long time naturally. So your native species are the ones that should be there, have been there. And I like to consider them like the locals. And this could be plants or animals or bacteria or fungi, any living, remember species is just a living organism. And in order for it to be two things to be considered the same species, they have to be able to reproduce fertile offspring. All right, so then invasive species are the newcomers. And they're the ones that are introduced in an unnatural way. Either they were brought in intentionally because humans thought they would make positive change, or that maybe they were brought in as a food source, or like the buckthorn was brought in because people thought it would be a nice ornamental tree. I'm not exactly sure about garlic mustard, but I believe it was brought in as a food source that people thought that it would make another food that we can eat. And then the term biodiversity, if we break that up, remember bio means life and diversity means diverse, so different. So diversity is the variety of living things in an area. So it's the variety of life. All right, so your assignment for Monday is going to be to go through and answer the questions in this reading. And then it also is asking you then on the last page to choose one of the 4 invasive species that are listed to do some research on your own. And I know it says to write a paragraph summarizing this. You don't have to write a paragraph. You just have to, you just have to answer these questions below. Okay. So you're going to pick which one you want to do research on, either the zebra mussel, the Japanese honeysuckle, old world climbing fern, or the Burmese python. So this was the python was introduced to Florida. So this is, when I was looking at this earlier, I want to make sure you guys know, oops. It's supposed to be Burmese python, not just any kind of python. So the Burmese python was introduced to Florida's ecosystem. And so if you wanted to study and look up what it did to the environment, you can. All right. The last thing I was going to do was introduce you to my python.